You guys, I have always had an affinity for language. Ever since I was a little girl, I always loved words. So much that when we were kids, in elementary school, they would have those scholastic order forms where you could order books. To this day, when I think about it, it's a little triggering for me because I always wanted to be able to order the books that I wanted in that order form. But unfortunately, we were so poor that I never could experience ordering books. The first opportunity that I ever got to choose a book outside of school in the school library was the public library. Going into my young adulthood, even when I was making wrong decisions and hanging out with the wrong people, I still had a connection to the library. Anybody that knows me knows I spent a lot of time in the library. I'm thankful for that because, spending time in the library is where I learned to develop my graphic design skills, my research skills. And these were all things that I was doing as a high school dropout, because even then I knew the value of education. Talking smack on me saying, oh, you trying to sound white, or who you trying to impress. But the truth was, I knew that there was more to the language than just our everyday slang. And I wanted to be able to have conversations with other people. I think the very first time I realized that my vocabulary was limited was when I had a telephone interview with this one company. Actually, it was for telemarketing. So you had to have the gift of gab. And that was something that I had when I was younger, but not being able to answer professional questions in an interview was a smack in my face. It really made me realize that I was missing out on life. And so from that point, I was very intentional about going to the library. Unfortunately, there are some instances where I did not want to return the book because, again, I never had owned a book. My mom never, ordered us books. We never went to bookstores and purchased books. That's why as a young adult, when I owned my house, I actually had an old pantry in my dining room, and it had shelves. It had like 4 shelves. And I literally turned that dining room pantry into a library. And the books that were in there were books that I, as an adult, had purchased myself. They were books that I had purchased at the flea market. Actually, at one point, I was going to open up a daycare center. And my daughter's father had actually found some books to donate to my daycare. And, my daughter, that's why my daughter to this day, she's an avid reader because she started reading at 2 years old because we had so many books at her fingertips and she was just so curious. And that's one thing that I will say I loved about reading is that it not only expanded your vocabulary, but it expanded your imagination. So I wanted to do this topic today because I realized that lack of communication skills is something that holds back marginalized communities. I come from one. I know that, people who read regularly often are teased or bullied or they don't fit in. And in our big ages of 30 and 40, we should be intentionally trying to enhance our vocabulary. Now, I don't know that I'll ever be an eloquent speaker, but that is a desire of mine. There's nothing like hearing someone be able to express themselves clearly and be able to adapt to the different audiences that they have. So part of me trying to stretch that muscle is creating this podcast. I wanted to put myself in a position where I would be forced to talk and where I would be forced to expand my vocabulary and be able to reach different audiences. So far, I think I've done okay. I do have a level of vocabulary where I'm able to adapt in a professional setting. I'm able to clearly articulate my thoughts, and I do know how to adjust my communication for my audience. But because this platform, I'm specifically trying to help individuals to improve their lives and to have purpose, I want to use this as a tool to be able to not necessarily educate people on how to communicate, but making it clear as to why communication is valued so highly and why it is a key element to success. That's not to say that a person can't become successful in other ways, but it allows you to enter rooms. It allows you to engage with people no matter where you go. We're going to dive into some of the reasons why education and reading and vocabulary is not valued in the hood where I'm from. And we're just going to talk about the necessity of being able to communicate clearly. As someone who works in a corporate position, I engage with individuals who also grew up in poverty or who grew up in the hood and who still use ebonics and slang on a daily basis when they're not working. Sometimes that can spill over into your professional career. If you are in a contact center and you're constantly speaking to people, do have to develop your vocabulary to be able to speak to certain members or certain customers and be respected. If you do not have, expanded vocabulary, people will not take you serious. They will discredit you. I would even go so far as to say the lack of communication in our communities is what often can lead to violence and abuse, because when individuals don't know how to express themselves, they end up acting out. And I think that is, and this is just my personal opinion, but I do believe that the root of many individuals acting out is because it's not that they can't control their emotions, it's because they don't know how to express them. So let's dig into the barriers to effective communication. So as I mentioned, I grew up in the hood. I grew up around people who spoke slang. My mother was more eloquent than most people in our neighborhood. My mom was college educated. She grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood and went to a very prestigious school. So within our house, I was able to pick up words when I would hear my mom, having conversations. But within our family and within our community, if you spoke proper, it was frowned upon. I believe it made people feel that you thought you were better than them. And there was a disconnect. I think in my younger years, I didn't realize that dynamic and I didn't value communication so much because I was part of the problem. I too would hear people who spoke very eloquently and immediately it's like they lost their black card. It wasn't until I experienced that myself from one of my elders in my family. She had called my phone and reached my voicemail. And I'll never forget the voicemail that she left me was, "Angela, why are you trying to sound white?" Wow. My feelings were hurt because here this was someone who I had looked up to and respected, who I would think would want to see their niece, elevate and grow and become something more than they have. But it was just discouraging. And I started to question myself, like, am I trying to be someone that I'm not? But at that time, I was a few years into a corporate career, and I knew that the conversations I was having on a daily basis were about taking action. They were actually productive. I kind of lost respect for that relative after that. Me being one of the oldest in my generation on my dad's side, I knew that I was paving a way for my younger siblings and cousins to get out of the ghetto, to escape the hood. And so I couldn't let the opinion of a relative affect the trajectory of my future. I continued down the path of increasing my knowledge, increasing my vocabulary, and spending more time with people who spoke better than me and who wanted better for me. There's a lot of societal and cultural factors that influence the way that we communicate. We see it a lot online as well. We see even educated people dumbing them. I don't want to say that they're dumbing themselves down, but we see educated people adapting to the lower vocabulary in order to be able to effectively communicate with that target audience. And in doing that, I understand and I get it. But at some point, we have to call a spade a spade. This younger generation is heavily influenced by Black culture. And let's be honest, some think it's cool to talk like us, to speak Ebonics. What that does is it makes people view you as uneducated, potentially view you as a non-contributing, member of society, someone who is just spreading ignorance, who is glorifying, the lack of education, who can't really express themselves or comprehend what a person is saying. And that could be a matter of life and death. That could be a matter of poverty or being successful. If you don't know how to identify or speak, if you don't know how to articulate what's happening to you, how can you get help, or how can you even know that there's a problem? That's why I learned that the power of words was when I started learning words like manipulator. I found out that at some point in my life, I was a manipulator, but until I knew what that word actually meant, I couldn't change the behavior. And that's the same thing with like gaslighting. That was a very popular term. I think it was a couple years ago. It was trending everywhere, gaslighting. And I'm like, who made up this term? Where did it come from? Well, it turns out it's a form of emotional abuse that many people experience, and not just in domestic relationships, but in professional relationships and friendships. And if you don't know what that word means, how can you know when you're experiencing it? There's so many other words that we have to, I believe is critical that we learn and that we be intentional about increasing our vocabulary, because knowing how to speak is a form of freedom. Being stylish is all about embracing your unique self, and Lala's Closet is here to help you do just that. Visit lalasclosetatl.com and check out the fantastic finds they have waiting for you. Some of the obvious barriers to communication are things like lack of access to education. Within marginalized communities, we already know that there's systemic barriers that prevent us, from accessing education. Everything as simple as, like I said, purchasing a book. You don't see many bookstores, near the hood. I mean, at least these days, if you do, it's most likely going to be in a gentrified community. But growing up, I remember we used to have to get on a bus to go to our nearest library. And then also, education plays a major part. They're already trying to take books out of the schools for various reasons. But just imagine the impact if you're someone who doesn't even have access to resources and you have a thirst for knowledge, and yet they're removing those resources from your school. I'll say this. My mother went to school and acquired her associate's degree and a bachelor's degree. And she did all of this while dealing with, mental health challenges, being a single parent. And so I saw her dedication, and I'm so grateful for my mom's example. As I have to say, when I looked around during that time in my life, I didn't have any other friends whose parents had college degrees, and I didn't have, and their parents weren't still pursuing education in their adulthood. So shout out to my mom. It really does have a ripple effect. Let's talk a little bit more about the limited resources. As I was saying, just growing up in a low income or low socioeconomic community, there is a lack of access to books. Yes, everybody has technology, but the content that our children and our people are consuming tend not to be those that are conducive with increasing your vocabulary. In fact, some of the content, when I listen to it, I can't continue because I'm getting a headache just from trying to understand what they're saying. Or when I read different messaging, people's comments online, it frustrates me when I see grammatical errors, when I see, common misspellings. It's like, nobody is challenging us to do better in that regard. I mean, I know they always call them the grammar police, but the grammar police are actually trying to look out. We tend to place a higher priority on surviving than pursuing our education. And it's unfortunate that at this point, it hasn't translated to that. Those who, go to school, those who read books, have access to more opportunity. Sitting here as a witness, yes, I've still faced systemic barriers. Yes, I still have had challenges within my corporate career, but the fact that I have these skills increases my confidence, and I'm more likely to go after that job that I really want. Another thing that affects our communication and is a barrier is the absence of positive role models. Now, I'm not perfect, but I tell you one thing. The purpose behind this podcast and my advocacy is because I am an example of someone who overcame my situation, who overcame poverty mindset, and who overcame surviving. I have had the opportunity to thrive, and it's not easy. It's never a straight path, but I continue to push myself because I want someone else to see that if Angee can make it out of Arlington Heights, one of the, low-income communities that is drug-ridden, gang violence, if I could make it out of that, then so can they. I think growing up, some of the most eloquent speakers that, we typically experience in the hood is our pastor. One thing I will say is that I just remember always being fascinated by the sermons because the pastors, they were breaking down words in the Bible. And I feel that the pastors were not just reading, passages in the Bible, but using them as opportunities to help expand our community's knowledge of the language, how to communicate, how to comprehend. If you're going to be reading the word, you got to be able to know how to interpret the word. And so I appreciate, all of the pastors who have leveraged, their position as a role model in the community and have used it to help enhance our community's education and perspective of communication. So I briefly touched on earlier the impact of cultural norms and values. And as I said before, with the internet and a lot of our people from our community having access to the internet and using it in abundance in comparison to those who are, instead of consuming content, are actually the ones creating it, it impacts the way that we express ourselves. Just, sharing memes is an example. While it's cute, it's funny, it gets the point across, does it further enhance your ability to express yourself? It's kind of like how we resorted to using emojis in text messages. At first, I was completely against it because I was like, who came up with this idea? This is dumb. I'd rather just say that I'm sad instead of sending a sad face. I'd rather say why I'm sad instead of sending a series of sad emojis, right? I think it just kind of delays getting your point across. I think at some point, even if you do use an emoji to express yourself in the moment, at some point you're going to have a real conversation. And then the question becomes, are you prepared to do that? Do you have the words? Do you have the right words? I also touched on there being stigmas, right? And stereotypes. It's funny how life goes, all of the little boys that, in school were considered nerds who don't have the ability to communicate. I personally, as a single woman, have gone on dates with some of these gentlemen who I wasn't always, someone who valued education, right? However, today I do. And so when I go on dates, often I hear them complaining that, they don't like dating these days because a lot of the women out here don't know how to communicate. It is something that a lot of successful men value. A lot of high value men or high quality men, they do want a woman who knows how to express herself, who they can take on to a corporate event and trust that, she'll be able to engage with people and be able to read the room. That is a skill. And I think that's where a lot of these young women who are beautiful, who look good on your arm, but I think that is the line that's drawn between wifey and, just something to do in the meantime. Those of us who are single, especially men, need to take note of that. Same thing, it's not just men, actually. Let me let me take that back, because I myself have encountered some amazing men, have great characteristics, but they're not able to hold a conversation. They're not be able to think beyond today or this week. They don't have a vision. And a lot of times they may actually have a dream. They may actually have something that they aspire to achieve, but they don't have the words to express that. And that's keeping them trapped. That's keeping them from being able to partner with the right person and, get in a relationship with the right person who's going to, help assist in that vision. You can't get someone to help you with a vision if you don't even know how to share it. Girl, you heard about that new clothing line called Diversity Drip? No, girl, what's that? Girl, it is all about celebrating our unique mix. They have stylish clothing, accessories, they even have stuff for your car. I know you lying. Oh, for real. Go to diversitydrip.com right now. I'm telling you, you're gonna love what you see. They got that drip. They got that drip. They got that drip. Diversity Drip Apparel, where your style tells your story. As I started thinking about this topic and why it was important for me to do, I started thinking about when I was younger, and I remember hearing the phrase acting out. I never heard that until I was detained in a juvenile correction center. And I thought this staff member was just saying that as, how our family will have these different sayings, to describe a person's behavior. But I didn't realize that the phrase acting out is actually like a clinical term. I want to dive into this topic because I think it's important for us to understand exactly what acting out is. In the medical world, in the realm of mental health, I know our people are struggling, there's stigma, people are not getting the help that they need. But how can you if you don't have the right words? So to act out in the theatrical realm, it means to perform as if it were a play or to translate something into action. Another definition says perform an action or action thought to provide an outlet for emotional or mental conflicts. If a person is experiencing an emotion and they don't know how to verbalize it, they don't know how to articulate it, they don't have the ability to communicate it in a timely manner, but they want to react to what they're experiencing. They want someone to know how they're feeling. And so because they don't have the words to sit down and have a decent conversation, we hear that all the time. Y'all need to just have a decent conversation. Can we have a decent conversation? The reason people are asking for a decent conversation is because they realize that without that, the only thing left to do is to react. And that typically correlates to bad behavior. So another definition, it says to represent in action. Now, the example they provided, and this is actually Merriam-Webster, the example they provided, the sentence, it says, children act out what they read. Okay, so again, that is in its most simplest form. Acting out is doing just, that's just the common definition of acting out, is to, basically act. But I like that they use the word children. And I think that we need to understand that as adults, I imagine people listening to this podcast are over 18. They may not, but let's just talk about adults for a minute. Adults who have a limited vocabulary or who have limited ways to express themselves, they are typically going to be childlike, and not childlike in an innocent way, but childlike in an immature way. And so what do children do when they don't get their way? They act out. They throw tantrums. They do things to get your attention Sometimes those things hurt you, and that's not necessarily their intention, but they're wanting to get your attention so that you can address their needs that they're not able to communicate effectively. Whew. Of course, we know children will act out because they have the limited vocabulary. Part of their coming into adulthood is developing that vocabulary, developing their voice. But there are some adults who don't know how to effectively express how they're feeling, and so they resort to different behaviors. It could be, ignoring you, completely silent treatment. You know what? I have no words. We hear that all the time. I have no words. There really are people who have no words. And I have to say, I do respect that. If someone is giving me the silent treatment, while I may not know their intention, I now have enough emotional intelligence to realize that if this person is not forthcoming with a conversation, they may not have the words right now. That's not to say later on, after they take some time to think about it, maybe they may have to read up on the subject about it. Maybe they have to talk to someone else about it to gather their thoughts, to gather their words, and then come back. I can respect that. But what I don't respect is when people resort to action that they cannot reverse. Saying things, just ignorant things, attacking you. Look, that is the pattern that they've, exhibited throughout life, verbally attacking, using the limited words that they have as an outlet for their frustration, instead of using their words for a solution. Every once in a while I'll drop, an F-bomb here or there, but I don't typically have a potty mouth, because I do feel that when people are using curse words all the time, to me, it signifies that they have limited vocabulary. It tells me that whoever they're talking to is not worth them, going inside and finding the right words. And in some cases, that might be true. If somebody's just being completely disrespectful towards you, or, they're just rude, whatever the case, you may not even want to handle them with care. You may be intentionally firing, cuss words at this person because you are intending to hurt them. You don't care about a solution. This is just how you're going to, release, right? But when you're talking about loved ones and people that we deal with on a daily basis, our coworkers, our spouses, our neighbors, our children, words matter. Let's talk about how this relates to mental health challenges. The inability for someone to express how they're feeling can result in a person becoming overwhelmed with emotion. And again, acting out can also be indicative of a mental health issue. Well, if a person isn't able to effectively communicate how they feel or effectively communicate what they've been through, they're going to repeat a cycle. And you know what they say, if you keep doing the same thing expecting to get different results, that's insanity. I believe that, a person's inability to effectively communicate what they're dealing with, it does create a cycle of insanity. They're not getting their needs met, but they're trying. Sometimes, unfortunately, that might be through physical violence. It could be self-harm. It could be abusing drugs and alcohol. But they are trying to escape what they're dealing with, and they just don't have the words to communicate. So as I continue on this path of advocating for our people, marginalized communities, in conjunction with my advocacy for mental health, I'm definitely going to bring to the forefront the issue of lack of communication and knowing what to say, how that can lead to better outcomes. There's a website called findyourwords.org. I highly encourage you all to take a look at it, check it out, share it. Findyourwords.org will help you learn how to talk through what you're going through. When these mental health issues are not resolved, or these emotional conflicts that we may have, if people are not able to articulate what they're experiencing, they're not going to be able to get the help that they need. And I just feel that being able to effectively communicate, it's a form of emotional release. and it is a step towards healing. So as we move forward, I want you guys to consider, when you're having conversations, listen. And I don't mean just listen to respond. I mean actively listen to the person you're speaking to. It will tell you a lot about them. Now, I'm not saying going around judging people because of their inability to speak, because let me tell you something. I've been there. I'm still actively trying to enhance my vocabulary and increase the effectiveness of my communication. And in doing so, and while I'm doing so, I'm trying to encourage others to do the same. Don't go judging people, but take this information and approach the situation from an informed perspective, knowing that, hey, this person is trying to convey something to me and they cannot find the words or they don't have the words. So let me give them some grace. Let me take this into consideration for how I respond to them. That's the goal. Because if you have someone, let's just say we do have a situation where you have an eloquent speaker talking to someone with a limited vocabulary, and they're judging that individual, not considering the barriers that person may have had, not considering the efforts that that person may have made, and not considering the journey that that person might be on to grow and evolve. That could really discourage them if that eloquent, effective communicator talks down to them. That could discourage them. That could make them act out. That can make them completely give up on trying to increase their vocabulary, on trying to become a better communicator. And the same goes in intimate relationships. We hear all the time that communication is the key to having a successful relationship. Well, if you don't know how to effectively communicate, or communication is triggering for you because someone has called you out on your lack of vocabulary, you're not going to want to speak. You're not going to want to talk. And as I will say, as a leader in corporate, I have to consider that when I'm talking to some of my direct reports and I'm using professional terms and what we call professional jargon, buzzwords, if you will, to some people, that may come across as intimidating because on one hand, they may see me as someone they can relate to. But the moment I go into my corporate jargon, that may be where the disconnect is. They may now look at me and say, she's just one of them. I can't trust her. She's not a good role model for me. I don't aspire to be like her. I don't want to work with her. I don't think she understands or sees me. So we have to be mindful. I personally, as I'm evolving and growing in my personal and professional life, I'm taking this knowledge and I'm applying it in real time in my roles, because I do have to understand that language is so powerful. I mean, even in the Bible, it says that, life and death is in the power of the tongue. This is not the end of this conversation. This is only the beginning. I want so much for us to improve in our communication, and I speak specifically to marginalized communities and people who have come up in the hood like myself. I want people to see the value in learning how to speak better and to, the value in becoming better at communicating. Not that you have to become a nerd, but you just have to have an interest in how to use your words to convey your thoughts, your feelings, your desires. This episode is really just scratching the surface. I definitely want to come back to this. I'll continue to come back to this topic from time to time. I really want to bring it to the forefront. I think that it's something that it's a solution to help our community. I've always said, I believe that, outside of the systemic barriers that we face, if we as a community can come together and identify where our areas of opportunity lie, one being education, it's fundamental. We always hear the saying, reading is fundamental. It is. In our community, if we can put a focus on education, it's so liberating. Even the next generation, just having access to the internet, I will say there have been some good that has come from it, because being on the internet, you do have access to more books and more knowledge and more opportunities to read. Now, the content itself may not necessarily be the best, but the children nowadays, I will say, have picked up information a lot faster than in my generation. And so accessing resources is a lot easier, for them. This is why I believe that education and intentional communication can truly make a difference. See, it's not just about talking, but it's about making connections, understanding one another, and transforming our realities. I hope you guys have enjoyed this topic. I hope that you found some value. And as we wrap up, I just want to remind you all that words do matter. On this episode, we talked about the barriers to communication. We talked about the cultural and societal norms that affect the way that we communicate. We've talked about not having words. We talked about how not having words can often lead to one acting out. And what does acting out lead to? Often violence, unfortunately, people getting hurt, killed. It just leads to a plethora of unnecessary damage that could be avoided if only we sat down and had a conversation. It would avoid so much damage and detriment and destruction in our community if we learn to sit down and have a conversation with one another. And that's the reason why I'm actually going to be starting a new initiative called Purposeful Conversations. Now, Purposeful Conversations isn't just specifically on effective communication and building vocabulary and things of that sort. Purposeful Conversations is me gathering people together and having dialogue around topics that are meaningful, purposeful, and that matter within our community and the world at large. And so in order to be able to do that, I, as the facilitator, have to understand that the people that are going to be joining these conversations, their communication is not going to be on the level that mine is. And even some of the guests that I bring onto my podcast or that I bring into those dialogues, they may have a larger, vocabulary than myself. They may be more effective communicators than myself. But the goal is to get our people comfortable with speaking, with articulating, with expressing their thoughts. Because let me tell you something, if you do not release your thoughts, I don't care if you release it through physical activity or physical violence, if you do not release the thoughts in your mind, you're not able to communicate. Could you imagine what your poor brain is doing, retaining all that information? It's no wonder people have outbursts. It's no wonder people explode and go off on people. But imagine years and years and years of being silenced. See, we often say that people are silenced, but some people are silent by choice. It's not that they're choosing silence. It's because they don't really have any other choice but to be silent. And so that's what we want to empower people. Communicating effectively is empowerment. I really, truly hope that people listening, I really hope that you all listening get this and understand where I'm coming from. More to come about the Purposeful Conversations. But finding our words, you all, it's more than just about talking. It is really about having a voice for yourself, being understood, and ultimately being able to transform from who you were into who you were destined to be. So let's keep pushing through these barriers, y'all. Let's expand our circles. Let's speak our truths, because when we find our words, we find our power. Thank you so much for joining me, you guys. Stay tuned, stay purposeful, and keep shining.